Trust is the foundation for everything. With trust, you have creativity, productivity, and financial results. With trust, you have strong marriages and healthy relationships with your kids, your parents, your friends. But how do you measure trust? Trust is relatively intangible, abstract construct that's hard to measure. You can't just send a questionnaire and ask people, what is the level of trust in your organization? Trust is relative, and therefore, no absolute answer would be accurate. Yes, if trust is the foundation for everything, you must measure it somehow. In this episode, I will provide a philosophy on how you should measure trust.
Welcome to The Trust Show. I'm Yoram Solomon, your host, the author of the Book of Trust, and facilitator of the Trust Habits Workshop. My mission is simple. I want to help you form habits that build your trustworthiness, because the answer to this question will have the biggest impact on your personal and professional success or failure. Can I trust you?
Why is trust so hard to measure? Trust is kind of a vague, abstract, intangible construct that's hard to measure as a result. There is a great book that I would recommend by Douglas Hubbard called How to Measure Anything. And that's a book that mostly talks about businesses and how you measure all kinds of intangibles in business that typically you think can't be measured. So that's a great book. But you know, the problem with measuring trust is really that you can't just ask what is the level of trust. Trust is relative. The first several laws of trust indicate that trust is continuous. There's a certain level of trust that you might need different levels in different contexts. Trust is contextual. That's the second law. In different contexts, you need trust even in different things. And then trust is personal. One person will trust you, another person will not, and it could even be for you doing exactly the same things. So how do you measure it? I think you also need to ask yourself for different things, what is the level of trust that's required? For some things, you don't need a lot of trust. For other things, you need more. And remember that it is personal in that if you think about it, what is trust? Why do you need trust? It all starts with risk. You're facing a certain risk. The risk is objective. Your fear of that risk is subjective. So you and I may face exactly the same objective risk, but one of us is going to be more afraid or less afraid of that same risk. Trust is a function of, or trust is that thing that takes us, if we have more trust in the level of fear that we're experiencing, we feel safe. If we have less trust, we feel that we're in danger. So even that's a personal thing. So you can't just say we have a certain level of trust on a scale of 7, it's 5 out of 7, and that's good enough. It depends on whether it's good enough for the people who are facing a situation where they need to trust other people. The last thing before I start going into how do you exactly measure it is that trust is really it's something that's related to the dependency. If you don't depend on me and what I do in my job, then you don't need a high level of trust in me. The problem always starts when you depend on me, but you don't trust me. If you don't depend on me and you don't trust me, that's fine. You know, nobody's losing anything. If you depend on me and you trust me, that's great. The problem is when you depend on me and you don't trust me, and those are the things that you want to identify. And this is why my Trust Tracker tool, which I'll briefly talk about, has this matrix of how different people trust different other people on the team. But it's linked, the scale of whether this is an issue or not, or a critical issue or not, depends on dependencies between two different people.
If you like this video, click the like button, subscribe to this channel, and get notified when I release more videos like this.
So if trust and trustworthiness are a little hard to measure, how do we measure them? The approach that I like to take is what I call the black box approach. So take an electric motor, for example. If you don't know how an electric motor works, to you an electric motor is really a black box. It has inputs, it has outputs. An electric motor, the input is electricity. It's voltage, it's current, power, frequency, things that are easy to measure. On the output, you got torque, you got speed, revolutions per minute, RPMs. So there are things on the input and the output that can be measured even if you don't measure anything inside. Like you never measure the magnetic field. I mean, you can, but it's really hard to measure. What you do is you measure the input, you measure the output. That's exactly what I recommend that we do with trust, which will take me to the trust chain that I covered in the Book of Trust, the third edition of the Book of Trust, or the mini Book of Trust. The trust chain starts with the components of trustworthiness. I'll talk about them in the next block. The components of trustworthiness. If they exist, then trustworthiness exists. If trustworthiness exists, then a certain level of trust exists. You can measure trust, but you can measure the output of trust. You can measure symptoms of having or not having trust. So what we're going to do is we're going to measure the inputs, the components that make people trustworthy, and we're going to measure the outputs, the symptoms of having or not having trust. And based on those, we're going to determine the level of trust and trustworthiness within the organization. Let's consider measuring the inputs for trust. Those are the 6 components of trustworthiness, and they're made of 2 groups of components, the who you are and what you do during an interaction. The who you are would be competence, personality compatibility, and symmetry, and fairness is part of it. The what you do is what you do during an interaction, and that is the positivity of what you contribute into an interaction, the time, and the intimacy. Time, how long you spend together, how frequently you meet, how predictable are the meetings? Are they ad hoc or are they scheduled? And the intimacy of communications, email versus face-to-face, one-on-one, in person. Now, I'm not saying that to have a high level of trust, all the meetings have to be in person, one-on-one, and very high intimacy, but it's the balance between them. When I talk about the personality compatibility, that varies with different people. And this is why you can't really measure the overall level of personality compatibility without actually determining the level of personality compatibility between every 2 people. And by the way, even that is different in both directions. So for example, if I take personality compatibility, there are the universal and absolute elements, like, for example, telling the truth. If somebody lies to you continuously and intentionally and knowingly, then you don't trust them. And that's pretty absolute. That's pretty universal. But when we start going into the more personal, more different, there is no absolute bad or good. Those would be things like take risk-taking, for example. And that takes me back to the contextual nature of trust. Risk-taking in a production line job, not very appreciated. So if you have someone in accounting that is taking a lot of risk with how they structure their accounting reports, well, that's not a high trust factor. On the other hand, marketing, you're looking for creativity. You're looking for breaking the rules. You're looking for somebody who pushes the envelopes. The same with product creativity, the innovation. Innovation has to be something where you're willing to take risks, try things, and fail. So it's contextual and it is personal. Those are the inputs. Those are on the input side. And you're going to be able to measure them a lot more than just put a number on trustworthiness or trust. So we're going to reflect on trustworthiness and trust as a function of those inputs. So if the inputs exist and the inputs are the leading indicators, if they exist, that means that we're going to have trustworthiness, and we're going to assume that if we have trustworthiness, obviously, trust is the product of trustworthiness and trustability, and you can only do something about your own trustworthiness. But if we measure the inputs, and the inputs are good, that means that there's trustworthiness and probably trust. Let's switch to the outputs. What are the outputs? The outputs, once again, they depend on the type of the relationship. So, for example, the indications of having trust when you are considering your boss, the level of trust you have in your boss, the symptoms, the indications, the trailing indicators for that are, do you get autonomy? And again, the definition of autonomy is not autonomy, do whatever. Autonomy is, this is what you must do. You decide how to do it. So do you get autonomy, or does it rank on the other side of the scale? Your boss gives you complete bureaucracy, do exactly this. They micromanage you. The more autonomy you get from your boss, that means that your boss has a higher level of trust in you. Because they're not going to, if they don't trust you, they're not going to give you autonomy. If they give you bureaucracy, they probably don't trust you. The other way around, the level of trust that employees have in their bosses will be a symptom of whether they trust their bosses or not. If they are fully accountable, if they're willing to take risks, if they're willing to come back with bad news, then they trust you as a boss, as their boss. If all they do is CYA, I do exactly what you told me, I don't divert left or right, then they probably don't trust you. Those are easier things to measure than the level of trust itself, than putting a number on the level of trust. Well, there are some components that are more generic in terms of, take for example, constructive disagreement. Your willingness, because you have the ability, your willingness to hold a constructive disagreement. So it's kind of a spectrum. A constructive disagreement is where you can be very passionate but still professional and remain friends. A destructive disagreement, on the other hand, is when you become personal. Everything becomes personal. It's not an argument anymore. It's not a disagreement. It's a conflict. It's war. It's a battle. It's personal. It's emotional. It's irrational. And it's definitely not productive. The other side of it is the ultra nice disagreement, which is not really a disagreement. It's just, I'm just going to tell you what you want to hear. I'm not telling you what I really feel. This is the politically correct disagreement, or not even disagreement, because you're not going to disagree. You're trying to avoid disagreement. This is when you have the meeting before the meeting after the meeting, just not the meeting during the meeting. This is when things are settled in hallways and private offices and one-on-one, rather than as a team when you can be the most productive. So where you rank on that reflects on the level of trust that you have in the team. So once again, easier to measure. It's a lot easier to ask a person to describe the level of disagreements that they have, or how do they disagree, than it is to try and ask them the level of trust. But you can infer from it, because the constructive disagreement or level of disagreement is a trailing indicator, is an output, is a symptom of whether you have or not have trust. Another one is your willingness to be vulnerable. Another one is your willingness to give feedback. Another one is your receptivity to feedback. Those are a little more generic, and they reflect on the level of trust, because you're not willing to be vulnerable with another person if you don't trust them. You're not willing to ask stupid questions. You're not willing to ask tough questions. You're not willing to give feedback if you don't trust the other person. I know that when we want to measure something, we like to have an assessment, a form, a multiple choice device, instrument that would allow us to measure things. And most of the instruments are exactly like that. There's no open-ended, there's no text answers. It just, choose from these options. And it's so much easier to handle, because almost doesn't matter how many people respond, because you're going to get the response in an Excel spreadsheet, and you're going to, or a Google Sheet, and you're going to deploy statistical functions on it, and you're going to get the numbers, and you're going to decide what is the level of trust, or whatever it is that you're measuring. with this instrument. But I'm afraid that because trust is so relative and so personal and contextual, that it's a little hard to measure it with a standard tool with multiple options. One is because it's contextual, what questions are you going to ask? I mean, the level of trust that you have in your boss is going to have a different set of questions than the level of trust you have in your employee. The symptoms, on one hand, you're going to have accountability or autonomy and bureaucracy versus bureaucracy. On the other hand, you're going to have autonomy, accountability, and CYA. So those are different questions based on the context. But different people even see things differently. And this is where it becomes personal. When I did my PhD research, I remember actually before the research, when I was still doing coursework, my academic advisor called me once and thought that I was having a hard time choosing the right classes for next semester. And the reason he did that was because I chose both qualitative and quantitative research classes. Well, typically in a PhD study, when you get to that phase, you already know what you're going to research and you already know what the methodology is going to be, if it's quantitative or qualitative, and you would only take those classes. To me, I gave up on a minor with my PhD just so that I can take every single research class that they had, quantitative and qualitative. My mentor actually referred to them with slightly different names. Quantitative, the ones with multiple choices, surveys, he referred to them as explanatory or confirmatory. You already have kind of a structure in your head, you know where you're going, and you just want people to rank, and you use statistical analysis for that. A lot easier to handle, and this is by the way why most of the research dissertations are quantitative. They're shorter. Mine was qualitative. It was actually mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative here refers to as exploratory. This is where you explore further. And I would suggest that because the metrics are so relative and contextual and personal, that maybe a more qualitative approach to investigate trust is in order. So for every component, for example, I would first ask, what makes this rank high? So take competence, for example. What makes you think of a person in that position to be competent? Now, you may get a long list, so you want to ask them to prioritize it. So what's the top number one thing that would make you think that a person in that position is competent? You got number one. Maybe get number two and number three. Don't go too deep into that. So what's number one, number two, number three that make you think that that person is competent? Then, how do you rank them on each one of them? Best there is, worst there is. Rank that. Now you get a real true evaluation of the level of trust because you used a qualitative, more relative way to measure it. Again, if I go back to context, risk-taking, procrastination, it depends. It depends on the context. And so just having a set of questions would cause two things. One is you're going to have very long surveys, and two, you're going to look at answers and you're going to see that person A ranks person B high on X and low on Y, but without knowing what has higher priority, you don't know whether they trust them or not. So having a qualitative approach is probably better to measure trust, both inputs and outputs from the organization. I mentioned autonomy. Autonomy may not be important to you to consider trust, or accountability may not be important, depending on your role. So asking what makes you think that a person is competent. You share personalities with them, or they're compatible with you from a personality standpoint. What is it? Give me 1, 2, 3 most important ones, and how do you rank the other person? You can even possibly use some artificial intelligence tools that would understand the text. You don't have to do that in an interview. Interview takes a long time and a lot of effort. Would possibly be great to do it that way. But you can even do that with a survey, just you have an open-ended text responses rather than multiple choices. And you may use, as I said, artificial intelligence tools that would help you discern from that or extract from that the level of trust that you have in the organization.
This is the shorter video version of the Trust Show podcast. You can listen to the full episode anywhere you listen to your favorite podcasts.